Welcome to Nation Scope, where the world's biggest questions collide with forgotten history, secret negotiations, and decisions that reshape the modern map. Imagine a frozen island larger than Mexico, sitting between superpowers, rich in untapped resources, and the United States tried to buy it more than once. So why doesn't America own Greenland today? The answer is a gripping true story of ambition, war, diplomacy, and a people who refuse to be sold. Greenland looks empty on a map, a vast white mass hovering between North America and Europe, but that emptiness is an illusion. For thousands of years, human life has clung to this island against brutal odds. Long before the United States even existed, Greenland was already shaping the ambitions of empires. The first known inhabitants arrived more than 4,000 years ago, migrating across the Arctic from what is now Canada. These early peoples adapted to extreme cold in ways that still astonish historians and anthropologists. They hunted seals through ice holes, navigated freezing seas in skin boats, and built entire cultures around survival in a land where nature never forgives mistakes. Their descendants, the Inuit, did not see Greenland as a resource to be owned, but as a living environment to be respected. That worldview would clash violently with the mindset of Europe. In the late 10th century, Norse explorers led by Eric the Red reached Greenland after being exiled from Iceland. He named the island Greenland, not as a description but as marketing. The name was meant to attract settlers. It worked briefly. Viking communities sprang up along the southern coast, building farms, churches, and trade routes connecting Greenland to Norway and Iceland. For centuries, Greenland was considered part of the Norse world, tied politically and culturally to Scandinavia. But the island never made things easy. As temperatures dropped during the Little Ice Age, farming became harder. Trade declined. Eventually, the Norse settlements vanished, leaving behind ruins and unanswered questions. Greenland, once again, belonged only to its indigenous inhabitants, until Europe returned with a different kind of ambition. By the 1700s, Denmark reasserted control over Greenland, claiming it as part of the Danish-Norwegian kingdom. When Denmark and Norway split in 1814, Greenland remained under Danish authority. This detail would later become critically important, because it established a legal claim that no amount of American money could simply erase. Still, geography has a way of rewriting destiny. Greenland sits astride the shortest route between North America and Europe. Long before satellites and missiles, this position made it invaluable for trade, exploration, and eventually war. As the United States expanded westward in the 19th century, American leaders began to look north, not for adventure but for leverage. In 1867, the same year the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia, Secretary of State William H. Seward quietly explored the idea of buying Greenland as well. The logic was simple and ruthless. If the United States could control Alaska and Greenland, it would dominate the northern approaches to the continent. Trade routes, naval power, and future military advantages would all tilt in America's favor. But there was a problem. Greenland was not empty land, and Denmark was not desperate enough to sell. At the time, the United States was recovering from the Civil War. Many Americans already thought the Alaska purchase was a foolish mistake, mocking it as Seward's icebox. Adding Greenland to the deal seemed excessive, even absurd. Congress showed little enthusiasm, and the idea quietly faded. Greenland remained Danish, and America turned its attention elsewhere. For a while. The 20th century changed everything. When World War II erupted and Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in 1940, Greenland's status suddenly became a matter of survival. Denmark could no longer defend or supply the island. The United States, officially neutral at the time, stepped in. American forces built air bases and weather stations across Greenland, turning the island into a critical hub for transatlantic flights and early warning systems. For the first time, the United States was physically embedded in Greenland's landscape. This wartime presence altered how American strategists viewed the island. Greenland was no longer just a frozen curiosity. It was a shield, a forward outpost, a strategic prize in a world where future wars would be fought not only with soldiers, but with bombers and missiles crossing the Arctic sky. By the time the war ended, one thing was clear to Washington: Greenland mattered more than ever. And this time the United States wouldn't just consider buying it. They would make an offer. When World War II ended, the world did not return to peace. It slid almost immediately into something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. The United States emerged as a global superpower, locked in an ideological and military standoff with the Soviet Union. Missiles replaced battleships. Bombers replaced infantry. And geography, more than ever before, became destiny. In this new world order, Greenland transformed from a distant Arctic possession into one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land on Earth. American military planners studied maps obsessively. If Soviet bombers or missiles were ever launched toward the United States, the shortest path would be over the North Pole. That path ran directly across Greenland. Whoever controlled the island could see the attack coming first, or stop it entirely. Early warning radar systems, air bases, and refueling stations placed on Greenland could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The United States already had a foothold there. During the war, America had built several bases under emergency agreements with Denmark's government in exile. After the war, Washington expected those arrangements to continue indefinitely. But temporary access was no longer enough. Ownership was the goal. In 1946, the United States made a move so bold it stunned diplomats on both sides of the Atlantic. President Harry S. Truman's administration formally offered to buy Greenland from Denmark for $100 million in gold, an enormous sum at the time. The offer was not a rumor, not a back-channel suggestion, but an official proposal delivered through diplomatic channels. The reasoning was cold, calculated, and entirely strategic. The U.S. argued that Greenland was essential for continental defense, not just for America but for the entire Western Alliance. With Europe devastated by war and the Soviet Union rapidly expanding its influence, the Arctic was becoming the front line of the next global conflict. The United States believed that owning Greenland outright would simplify defense planning, secure long-term military installations, and remove any uncertainty about access in times of crisis. From Washington's perspective, the deal made sense. From Copenhagen's perspective, it was unthinkable. Denmark had just emerged from 5 years of Nazi occupation. National pride was fragile, sovereignty deeply cherished, and the idea of selling territory, especially one tied so closely to Danish identity, felt like a betrayal of hard-won independence. Greenland was not just land. It was history, responsibility, and obligation. The Danish government's response was swift and firm. Greenland was not for sale. But the rejection went deeper than simple nationalism. Behind closed doors, Danish officials worried about the precedent such a sale would set. If Denmark sold Greenland to the United States, what would stop other powerful nations from pressuring smaller countries to give up territory in the name of security? The post-war world was already unstable. Selling Greenland could legitimize a dangerous new form of imperialism dressed up as defense cooperation. There was also the issue of the Greenlandic people themselves. For centuries, decisions about Greenland had been made in distant capitals. First in Copenhagen, now potentially in Washington. But by the mid-20th century, attitudes were beginning to shift. The Inuit population was increasingly vocal about their rights, culture, and future. Selling Greenland without their consent would not just be politically risky, it would be morally indefensible. The United States, however, did not back away. Although the purchase offer was rejected, Washington secured a different kind of victory. In 1951, the U.S. and Denmark signed a new defense agreement that allowed America to maintain and expand military bases on Greenland, including what would become the most famous of them all, Thule Air Base. Thule was more than a base. It was a symbol. Built in the far north of Greenland, Thule became a cornerstone of America's early warning radar system. Massive antennas scanned the Arctic skies day and night, searching for any sign of incoming Soviet missiles. Nuclear bombers rotated through the base. Secret projects were launched beneath the ice. At one point, the U.S. even explored hiding nuclear weapons in tunnels carved deep under Greenland's ice sheet. Officially, Greenland was still Danish territory. In reality, it had become one of the most militarized and strategically significant locations in the American defense network. This uneasy arrangement created a paradox. The United States controlled Greenland's skies, defended its shores, and relied on its geography for national survival, yet did not own it. Denmark retained sovereignty, but depended heavily on American protection and investment. Greenland itself stood in the middle, its land hosting global superpower tensions that had little to do with the daily lives of its people. And as the Cold War intensified, this imbalance would only grow more complicated. Because while missiles and radar stations dominated headlines, something else was changing quietly beneath the ice, something that would make Greenland more valuable than anyone had imagined. Not just as a military outpost, but as a treasure trove of resources in a warming world. For most of modern history, Greenland's ice was seen as a barrier, an obstacle to settlement, development, and profit. Its vast glaciers and frozen interior discouraged agriculture, mining, and large-scale industry. To outsiders, Greenland appeared valuable only for where it sat, not for what it held. That assumption would not survive the late 20th century. As global temperatures began to rise, scientists noticed something alarming and revealing at the same time. Greenland's ice sheet, one of the largest on Earth, was melting at accelerating rates. While the environmental consequences were severe, the geopolitical consequences were just as profound. As ice retreated, it exposed land that had been inaccessible for millennia. And beneath that land lay resources that could reshape global power. Geological surveys revealed that Greenland is rich in rare earth elements, uranium, zinc, iron, or gold, oil, and natural gas. Rare earth elements, in particular, are essential for modern technology. Smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, missile guidance systems, and advanced military hardware all depend on them. For decades, China had dominated the global supply of these critical materials, giving Beijing enormous leverage over global manufacturing and defense industries. Suddenly, Greenland wasn't just strategically located. It was strategically loaded. American policymakers took notice. So did the rest of the world. As Arctic sea ice declined, new shipping routes began to open. The Northern Sea Route and potential transpolar passages promised to dramatically shorten travel times between Asia, Europe, and North America. Control over Arctic infrastructure, ports, airfields, monitoring stations, would become a key advantage in global trade. Greenland sat at the center of this emerging Arctic future. For Denmark, this created a dilemma. The island's growing economic potential made it more valuable than ever, but also more vulnerable. Foreign investment poured in, particularly from Chinese companies interested in mining projects and infrastructure development. Airports, ports, and mineral extraction sites became geopolitical flashpoints, raising alarm bells in Washington. From the American perspective, history seemed to be repeating itself. Only this time the rival wasn't the Soviet Union but China. U.S. officials began to worry that if Greenland drifted economically or politically toward Beijing, America's Arctic security could be compromised. Radar installations, military bases, and supply lines could suddenly exist alongside Chinese-backed infrastructure projects. The idea of a hostile power gaining influence so close to North America was unacceptable to U.S. defense planners. Ownership once again became part of the conversation. But this time the world would find out. In 2019, reports emerged that the United States, under President Donald Trump, was exploring the idea of purchasing Greenland yet again. Unlike the quiet diplomatic feelers of the 19th century or the classified negotiations of the Cold War, this attempt exploded into public view. Headlines mocked the proposal. Late-night comedians turned it into a punchline. Social media erupted with disbelief. Denmark's response was immediate and unequivocal. Greenland is not for sale. The Danish Prime Minister called the idea absurd. Greenland's leaders were even more direct, emphasizing that the island belonged to its people, not Denmark and certainly not the United States. What made this moment different from 1946 was that Greenland now had its own autonomous government. While still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland had gained home rule in 1979 and expanded self-governance in 2009. For the first time in history, Greenland had a formal political voice. And that voice was clear. The idea of being bought, again, felt like an echo of colonial thinking that many Greenlanders were trying to escape. Economic development was welcome, but not at the cost of sovereignty or identity. Greenland wanted partnerships, not ownership. Still, the renewed interest revealed a deeper truth. The United States didn't want Greenland out of greed or novelty. It wanted security, stability, and influence in a rapidly changing Arctic. Climate change had transformed Greenland from a frozen afterthought into a frontline of global competition. And America, facing rising rivals and uncertain alliances, was looking for certainty in an uncertain world. But buying Greenland was no longer just a matter of money and diplomacy. It was a question of self-determination. The people who lived on the island, whose ancestors survived its harshest eras, now stood between superpowers and their ambitions. Any future involving Greenland would have to include them, not erase them. And that reality explained something crucial. The United States didn't fail to buy Greenland because it lacked the money or power. It failed because the world had changed. Empires could no longer simply purchase land and people as if they were assets on a balance sheet. Sovereignty, identity, and consent now mattered, at least enough to stop a deal that once might have gone through quietly. Yet the story doesn't end there. Because even without owning Greenland, the United States continues to shape its future, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. And as the Arctic becomes one of the most contested regions on Earth, the question is no longer why America doesn't own Greenland. It's whether anyone truly can. For centuries, Greenland's fate was decided elsewhere. First by Norse kings, then by colonial administrators in Copenhagen, and later by Cold War strategists thousands of miles away. But by the late 20th century, something fundamental began to change, not through war or revolution but through slow, deliberate political awakening. The push for Greenlandic self-rule did not emerge overnight. It grew out of lived experience. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Denmark pursued a policy of rapid modernization in Greenland. On paper, the goal was equality, bringing education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure up to Danish standards. In reality, the changes often came at a heavy cultural cost. Traditional hunting lifestyles were disrupted. Small settlements were consolidated into larger towns. Danish became the dominant language in schools and administration. Many Greenlanders felt like strangers in their own land. This tension produced a quiet but powerful response. By the 1970s, Greenlandic leaders began demanding greater control over local affairs. They weren't calling for separation yet, but they wanted dignity, autonomy, and the ability to shape their own future. In 1979, Denmark agreed to grant home rule, transferring authority over education, health, fisheries, and local governance to Greenland's newly established parliament. It was a historic moment. For the first time, Greenlanders were no longer simply subjects of a distant state. They were decision-makers. Their language gained official status. Their culture gained protection. Their political identity began to solidify. But independence remained a complicated dream. Greenland's economy was, and still is, fragile. Fishing dominates exports, particularly shrimp and halibut. Denmark provides substantial financial support each year in the form of a block grant, covering a large portion of public spending. This subsidy creates stability but also dependence. Full independence would mean replacing that income, either through natural resources, tourism, or foreign investment. And that's where geopolitics returns to the story. As Greenland gained greater autonomy, global powers became more interested, not less. Mining companies arrived with promises of jobs and development. Foreign governments offered infrastructure funding. Every deal came with questions. Who benefits? Who controls the profits? Who bears the environmental risks? Greenland's leaders found themselves walking a tightrope. They wanted economic independence without political subordination. They wanted foreign partners but not foreign masters. And above all, they wanted to avoid becoming a pawn in someone else's rivalry. In 2009, Greenland took another major step forward. A referendum overwhelmingly approved self-government, expanding local control over natural resources, policing, and the legal system. Crucially, the agreement also recognized Greenlanders as a distinct people under international law, with the right to self-determination. Independence was no longer hypothetical. It was a matter of timing. This shift fundamentally altered the equation for the United States. Any future attempt to purchase Greenland was now legally and morally impossible. Denmark could not sell what it no longer fully controlled. Greenland's consent would be required, and the idea of being bought outright was politically toxic. Instead, Washington adapted. The United States reopened its consulate in Nuuk after decades of absence. It increased diplomatic engagement with Greenlandic officials directly, bypassing Copenhagen in some cases. Investment funds were announced. Development aid was reframed as partnership. Military cooperation continued, but with greater sensitivity to local concerns. This wasn't ownership. It was influence. And influence in many ways is more powerful. Yet even influence has limits. Greenland's leaders have repeatedly emphasized that their future will not be dictated by fear of China, fear of Russia, or fear of American withdrawal. They want choices, options, leverage. By engaging multiple partners, Greenland increases its bargaining power and reduces dependence on any single actor. This strategy frustrates superpowers accustomed to clear lines of control. To Washington, Greenland is a critical defense asset. To Beijing, it is a source of strategic minerals. To Copenhagen, it is a constitutional responsibility and moral obligation. To Greenlanders themselves, it is home. These perspectives don't always align. As climate change accelerates, the stakes continue to rise. Melting ice exposes not only resources, but unresolved questions about borders, rights, and responsibility. Who regulates Arctic shipping lanes? Who enforces environmental protections? Who responds to accidents, spills, or military incidents in remote waters? Greenland sits at the center of all of it. And this reality explains something deeply important about why the United States does not own Greenland today. Because ownership would not solve these challenges. In fact, it might make them worse. Buying Greenland would inflame international tensions, undermine indigenous rights, and provoke resistance from the very population America would need as partners. It would turn cooperation into occupation, diplomacy into domination. Modern power doesn't always come from flags planted on territory. Sometimes it comes from restraint. From understanding that the world is no longer divided into lands that can be bought and sold, but into societies that must be engaged, respected, and negotiated with. Greenland's path forward remains uncertain. Independence may come in decades, not years. Economic transformation will take time. External pressures will intensify, not fade. But one thing is already clear. The reason the United States does not own Greenland is not because it failed. It's because Greenland is no longer something to be owned. It is something to be reckoned with. Greenland's story exposes a truth many people miss when they look at maps. Power is no longer just about land, it's about legitimacy, consent, and timing. The United States wanted Greenland because it understood its value earlier than most. But history moved faster than ambition. What was once an island that could be negotiated over in secret became a society with a voice. What was once a military shortcut became a homeland. And what was once seen as frozen and irrelevant now sits at the center of climate change, global trade, and great power rivalry. The United States does not own Greenland because the world that allowed such purchases no longer exists. Empires adapted, or they lost influence. America adapted. And Greenland? It's still writing its future. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history and the forces shaping our world today, subscribe to NationScope. Because the most powerful stories aren't always about what happened, but about what almost did.